Our second speaker this evening is Sam Drysdale. Sam currently has the illustrious position of Chaplaincy Assistant at the University of Reading. That means he works for me, and he could probably dish the dirt on me. Before that, he took a master's. Before that, he took a master's degree in theology at Durham, and then originally he was an English Lit student here in Reading. I know from many conversations with Sam that the topic of gender is very close to his heart and what that means in contemporary thinking. And tonight he'll be talking about the famous story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife in the book of Genesis. His presentation is called "She Caught Hold of Me, Potiphar's Wife and the Invisible Female Sexual Aggressor." Sam, welcome.
Hello there. I'll just share my screen. Right, okay. Yes, welcome to the talk on "She Caught Hold of Him, Potiphar's Wife and the Invisible Female Sexual Aggressor." So, quick content warning, this is a discussion about sexual harassment, sexual assault, and false accusations thereof. There'll be no graphic descriptions, and I'll be as sensitive as I can, but I'm very aware this is something people might have first-hand experience of, and if that's not something you feel you can handle right now, prioritize your health over anything else and check out as soon as you need to. But with that in mind, let's take the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife and swap the genders. And imagine that your daughter or your little sister or your cousin or a niece or someone you know has a job that she really loves. It's her first job and she's excelling at it. She's rising through the company faster than anybody thought she could. But then one day she comes home and she doesn't have her coat anymore. And you ask her, well, where's your coat? And she says, well, my boss's husband has it. And you say, well, why does he have it? And she says, well, because he tried to sleep with me, and the only way I could get away from him was by leaving it with him. And he's been offering to sleep with me every day for the past couple of weeks. I think it would be obvious at this point that this is sexual harassment and then sexual assault, if not out-and-out attempted rape. But I don't think we've noticed that with Genesis 39 and Potiphar's wife and Joseph. So I would like to read the story again, and I'll highlight a few features as I go along. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian, was one of Pharaoh's officials. A captain of the guard brought him from the Israelites who had taken him there. In the previous chapter, it mentions that Joseph is 17 when he's sold. It mentions that he's 30 when he starts working for Pharaoh. So we don't really know how old he is at this point, but he could be as young as 17 when this happens. The Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted his care to everything he owned. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." Very direct. But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. And how could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day he came into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. She caught hold of him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. The Hebrew word for caught hold of here has an undertone of either getting hold of a tool in order to use something, an object, or of arresting someone, or really getting a good grip on them. And although it says cloak, it really means any item of clothing, so it could be something much more intimate. When she saw he had left his cloak in her hand and run out of the house, she called the household servants. "Look," she said, This Hebrew has been brought here to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. As soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But Joseph also prospers here because the Lord is with him. And one thing I also wanted to mention is that she deliberately others him. She talks about him as a Hebrew, when she's talking to the fellow Egyptian servants, and she mentions both his race and his class, that Hebrew slave, when she's talking to her husband. So that's the story, but what's the traditional response generally been? The main response, I think, is to treat Joseph as a model of male chastity and resistance to temptation. When Paul says to flee from sexual immorality, people all typically assume that the flee is picking up the Joseph story. So we can see in devotionals like this, or on Got Questions, which is a fairly well-known conservative Christian website, there's this language of she tempted him day after day. She caught Joseph and pulled him to her, trying to seduce him. But Joseph did not stand around to argue or give himself time to reconsider. And this raises the question, is it appropriate to praise a victim of sexual harassment for avoiding being harassed? When it says that he refuses to be with her, is this him chastely avoiding temptation, or is this him avoiding victimization? Is that going to work? Yes. Sometimes there's an emphasis on this is Joseph's suffering. He's been tried to be murdered and kicked out by his family, and then he's a slave, and then he's in prison. And despite that, he is faithful to God, and God is faithful to him, which is good, but it's significant that his sexual victimization isn't recognized, even when his other victimization is. When Mrs. Potiphar is looked at in this sort of women's Bible study here, she's looked at as an adulteress who is inwardly empty and looking for attention. And she humiliated herself and Joseph, not just once, but repeatedly. She expected to find satisfaction in sex alone, which again is good so far as it goes, but stops shy of recognizing a sexual predator when it sees one. Even when she's recognized as someone doing something wrong, it's not quite the same thing. It's not quite the same thing that we'd recognize if a man had laid hold of a teenager in his care. This story turns up in quite a few other non-devotional sources, the most obvious being Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, in which it's fair to say it's largely played for laughs. Now, that in and of itself is not a problem. Comedy violence is comedy, not violence. Everything from, what's green and goes red at the flick of a switch, a frog in a blender, it's all jokes. But this musical was originally written by Lloyd Webber for, I think, his younger brother when he was in primary school. This is a musical that tends to be performed by children. I don't know if we'd ever have a male sexual predator performed for laughs by children. And as I say, comedy violence is comedy, not violence, but double standards in comedy violence are double standards and are not funny. Joseph, King of Dreams, the Prince of Egypt's less attractive younger brother, no offense, but the animation's not great. I think this is actually one of the best presentations. You really get a sense of her entitlement, her use of status, her manipulation, and although they can't go too hard in the paint because it's still for children, I think it gets credit for being one of the best presentations out there. One of the other places you find this story depicted a lot is in Renaissance and other portraiture. And what's interesting about this is they generally take the opportunity to depict her as looking very attractive. Now, that's not the only thing that happens, but even in this, you can still see that she's about the same age as him, which is an interesting choice. But this is still just how you do a Renaissance nude. And these are just other random Renaissance nudes, but the point is, it's taking an opportunity to depict a sexual assaulter as attractive. And that puts me in mind of something like this. And this is a frustrating habit with the popular press when they're writing about a female teacher and having sexually abused a male student, is they'll generally pick, or at least sometimes they will pick, these kind of glamour shots, or shots that make them look very attractive, or sometimes just straight up bikini shots, which sort of plays into this narrative that teenage boys, especially who have been sexually assaulted by their teachers, ought to be grateful, ought to be congratulated, that they must have secretly liked it, that it's really not a very serious crime. And there's a lot of really frustrating language. So there's a lot of had sex with pupil 15, performed oral sex, or having a sexual relationship, which all really funny ways of spelling abused and raped, which is the language we would, I would very appropriately, use for a male teacher and a 15-year-old, a 14-year-old girl. This story has also been garnered a substantial feminist response. This is The Woman's Bible. It's by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's kind of the Mary Wollstonecraft of American feminism. It's the oldest kind of systematic feminist treatment of the Bible that exists, I think. And this is what she has to say about it. It would have been generous, at least, if the editor of these pages could have given us one woman, the counterpart of Joseph, a noble, high-minded, virtuous type. It is most demoralizing reading for children and the unthinking masses, giving all alike the lowest possible idea of womanhood, who has no hope nor ambition of beyond conjugal unions with men they scarcely knew. Which, I suppose that's fine so far as it goes, but it isn't really getting to the core of the issue. A more contemporary one, this is a explicitly feminist and womanist text. Womanism is a sort of branch of thought coming largely from African American women, but wanting to kind of emphasize other ways in which people can be marginalized, not just by gender, so race and class and that sort of thing, and consciously critiquing what is sometimes called white feminism for largely wanting access to positions of power rather than to create a society in which there are no unjust positions of power. But this is what Barbara Essex has to say on the general background of the Bible, of the biblical patriarchal world. Women are seen as threatening and dangerous creatures who need to be controlled or destroyed. Women's stories and experiences are ignored or treated with disdain. In a patriarchal society, women are givers, not takers. The ideal woman is a mother, rather than one who is independent and or seductive. Commenting on specifically this story, she says, Mrs. Potiphar is almost a caricature of the sexually powerful and evil woman. She determines what she wants and goes after it. She is persistent and consistent. When her plans are thwarted, she shifts gears and makes another plan. In reality, she is a strong woman, focused, powerful, sexually liberated. Within patriarchy, she is a dangerous woman. Potiphar's wife is not a villain. She represents modern women who strive to be counted and recognized as full human beings. Women today continue to struggle with gaining respect in a culture that sees them as sexual objects or as wicked women for expressing their sexuality. And this strikes me as more of a manifestation of, okay, well, there's a South African philosopher called David Benatar, who is a right weirdo, but he's drawn a distinction between what he calls egalitarian feminism and partisan feminism. Egalitarian feminism is interested in justice. Partisan feminism is interested in accruing benefits for women, whether or not those benefits are just. And I think downgrading a sexual predator's actions and saying the only reason anybody thought it was bad is they don't like women doing things is much more of partisanship than than justice. In the Me Too era, Potiphar's wife became quite an interesting topic. This is from Sojourner's blog, Stop Using Potiphar's Wife to Discredit Oppressors. And I think I do agree with this point that it's wrong to use the story to, as I say, to somehow discredit all women coming forward. And that the text isn't about the reliability of women or victims or witnesses. And that the villain of Genesis 39 is less a lying woman than the social and political structures that enable human predators, whether sexual, political, or economic. Joseph's integrity and God's remarkable work remain the focus of the story rather than potential disruptive battle for truth. That means kind of partisan and going for victory, not truth. And that's fair, but there is a very real question about what do we do with false accusations of abuse and assaults, and how much, when do we come to the limits of sentiments like believe all women, believe all predators, believe all survivors, and false accusations of rape and abuse are a form of abuse, and they exist in a context of a legal system that is very, very capable of treating you as innocent until proven guilty. A fact that goes double and triple if you're male, if you're poor, if you're black, if you're Asian, if you're othered in any way. And I think simply dismissing and hurrying the question of false accusations off screen, as it were, isn't really a sufficient response. So I talked about this talk is about the invisible female sexual predator. So I think it's about time to start making her visible. And a very strong parallel to Mrs. Potiphar is this woman, Asia Argento, and this boy, Jimmy Bennett. Asia Argento is an Italian actress who was very prominent in the Me Too movement. She said that she was raped by Harvey Weinstein at the Cannes Film Festival in '97 and was kept in a fairly controlling relationship with him through threats of money and threats of exposure, through bribes of money and threats of exposure for quite a while. Jimmy Bennett is a child actor, and she actually played his mum in a film in 2004. And when he was 17, he said that she invited him to her hotel room, plied him with alcohol, and then first assaulted and then raped him. And she paid him, I think it was $38,000 or $380,000 to keep quiet when this started coming up. And later on, she claimed that this event never happened, that they had had sex consensually, and then that in fact he had assaulted her. And she went on some Italian chat show and said, you know, how can you even assault a man? I mean, she's the expert. And it's these kind of questions which show, these kind of cases which show the limits of simplistic victim and perpetrator dynamics, or assuming that punch up, punch down, structural problems can be used to dismiss questions about false accusations. And interestingly, I think some people were citing this case as though it discredited her claims to have been abused by Weinstein. I don't think it does. I think if anything, it lends credence to them. W.H. Auden got it right. He said, those to whom evil is done do evil in their turn. It isn't unusual if you look into the history of any abuser. You will generally find their own history of trauma and victimization that they need healing from and that they need to take responsibility for. But I'm not just offering an individual case. I have some statistics to back it up as well. In 2010, the American Center for Disease Prevention and Control did their National Intimate Partner and Sexual Victimization Survey, in which they introduced a new question, which was, have you ever been forced to penetrate somebody else sexually? And when they did, they found that men and women had a similar prevalence of non-consensual sex in the previous 12 months. When they extrapolated out their data, they estimated 1.27 million women and 1.267 million men. Although, interestingly enough, they described non-consensual sex for women as rape, but not for men. And that's in line with most legal definitions. The legal definition in England used the phrase penetrate with a penis, which means that only relatively recently has male-on-male rape been recognized as such. female on female rape would be counted as sexual assault, which carries less stigma and a lower sentence. And of course, so does female on male rape. Similarly, the National Crime Victimization Survey in 2012 found that male victims experience 38% of all sexual victimization. This is from Sexual Victimization of Men in America by Laura Stemple, which I can recommend you looking up. But it's not just that's male victimization. Here's some data on female perpetration. Among men reporting all forms of sexual victimization, 68.6% reported a female perpetrator, specifically being made to penetrate, the form of non-consensual sex that men are most likely to experience in a lifetime. The frequency of perpetration by women was 79.2% of men reporting, victimized men reported a female perpetrator. Moving specifically to sexual violence occurring in prisons, they found that among all adult prisoners reporting any type of staff sexual victimization, 80% reported only female perpetrators. An additional 5.1% reported both male and female perpetrators. Among all juveniles reporting staff sexual victimization, 89.3% reported only female perpetrators. She caught hold of him. And again, this is an article by Laura Stemple called Sexual Victimization Perpetrated by Women. Federal data reveals surprising prevalence. And here is the same data in graph form. Again, we have physically forced sex being about equal, sexual coercion and unwanted sexual contact being a million miles away from each other. Here is information on victimization in short-term and long-term prisons and by staff. And this is it in raw numbers, because this is just percentages. As we can see, the single biggest category is imprisoned men being victimized by female members, imprisoned men and boys being victimized by female members of staff. So yeah, so this is a very serious problem and raises the very serious question, what can Mrs. Potiphar and her interpreters teach us? Well, I think traditional interpreters can teach us that traditional gender roles with their emphasis on female passivity and male activity, perhaps a vague sensation of women being the fairer sex, being morally superior, being asexual symbols of purity, really help to obscure rather than highlight these kind of issues. While the cultural responses treat it as a bit of a joke or occasionally something even to be celebrated in a somewhat disturbing way. Feminist treatments of this topic generally reveal that viewing sexual violence through such an overly gendered paradigm, i.e. viewing it as male violence, viewing it as violence towards women, excludes our possibility of thinking about and recognizing male victims and female perpetrators just as much as any of the traditional roles. I have a friend called Dan who's a nurse, and when we were on holiday in Poland together, he was dancing in a club with a middle-aged woman who basically ended up feeling him up, and he said, that's actually fairly normal for a night out, but I can't talk about it because all of my Facebook friends are women. You know, he's a nurse, so they're all professional friends, and I feel like I'd be intruding on their space somehow. I think we recognize that phrases like, you know, firemen or policemen kind of indicate that this role is for men and might put women off coming forward and wanting to take it on. And I think it's also time to recognize that over-gendering abuse, referring to it as patriarchal, referring to it as male violence, referring to it as against women, has a similar effect of preventing male victims from feeling like it's legitimate for them to talk about their experiences. This is Angelina. This is another Renaissance portrait. I can't remember her name. And finally, I'd like to give the final thought on this to a woman called Diana Freitinger, who has written, I think, one of the best articles on this, called The Outrageous Tale of Mrs. Potiphar. Joseph's no means no, as the famous slogan of the anti-rape movement goes. But as a slave, as a foreigner, and a man, he is denied the right to say no, in the ancient story as well as in today's interpretations. In the tale, his master's wife ignores her rejection. In research history, Joseph is either made a chaste moral hero or Mrs. Potiphar is depicted as the real victim of the story. Joseph's victimhood, however, gets overlooked. Could this be the reason for a new kind of outrage? So I'd like to answer a few questions to end with. Are there other male victims of sexual violence in Scripture, of male or female perpetrators, that we have overlooked or not really seen as what they are? Have you seen any examples of male victims and female perpetrators being poorly represented in culture, either played off for laughs or through the tropes I've talked about? And are feminist concepts an aid or a hindrance to addressing this issue? Thank you for listening.
Sam, thank you so much. I'm really glad you gave a heads-up trigger warning at the beginning of that, because it certainly was graphic, but I think probably appropriately so. And really thank you for some of those statistics, which I have to say I found a complete eye-opener. So thank you so much. Just in the same way that we stop now for questions, I'd really like to open up the floor. Again, if you're not quite sure that you know how to kind of say it, maybe spend a while writing it, put into chat. Susie will read that for you. Would anyone like to switch on a camera and make a comment or a question or respond to one of Sam's questions?
It's just that I follow Eastenders a bit, and there's been a storyline over the last couple of months about one of the sort of the male characters who sort of realizes that he was a victim of paedophilia from a female carer when he was a child, and it was really interesting to see how that's been played out, and where actually there is no sort of, as far as I'm aware, demonization either way, and I think that's a really interesting sort of story and approach.
I mean,
as a source.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to give the impression that it's completely monolithic. Like, we don't have absolutely no resources for thinking about that, and I don't want to overstate the case. People, basically, when I explain what I'm doing with this talk, people pretty much get it straight away, and that, yeah, you know, I've very rarely had someone pushing back and quite explicitly saying, no, I'm not going to accept Joseph as a legitimate victim of sexual violence. And in terms of demonization, I think, I mean, like I say with Asia Argento, one of the biggest, like the single biggest predictor of being a perpetrator of sexual violence is being a victim of sexual violence. You know, there's a really great article by Emily Yoffe called What Explains Harvey and Louis and Anthony. She's going through all of the original targets of Me Too, and she says this. She goes into all kinds of research about the etiology of sexual violence, and at the end she tells a story about a guy she calls Robert, who was convicted of exposing himself to women on public transport and eventually getting hold of a woman's hand and putting it on his genitals. And she said, you know, he grew up, he was mixed race, and he grew up, but you look at him, he mixed race, white, black, and Native American. You look at him, you assume he's black. He grew up, his dad wasn't around, his brother was quite physically abusive, and his mum would occasionally laugh while that was happening. He spent a lot of time at other people's houses where one of his friends' mums exposed himself to her. And so in his head, he was, in a way, this weirdly sort of self-deceptive way, he was sort of almost like doing women a favor, like he was excited by it, so why wouldn't they be? And then when he went to prison, went through a offenders program, got diagnosed as bipolar, and like learned how to take responsibility for his healing, learned about impulse control, and kind of came out the other side of it a much more just repaired and like a not dangerous person. And I think that's far more plausible and a better thing to focus on for either male or female perpetrators than speculations about sort of like somehow these are a result of norms. Like they're not. Like people generally don't. As much as I've said that we don't notice it. If your son came to you and said this was happening, I think people would have a very different response. So yeah, no, and the other thing is, with female violence more generally, we either tend to go down the don't hit girls route and don't really address it, or we say, oh, well, you've broken both kind of the moral rules and the being a woman rules, so you must be a complete demon and we'll just not have nothing to do with you. And neither of those responses are sufficient, I think.
Sam, one of the really shocking things, I guess, from what you said, was the statistics about what was going on in prisons. And I think that the stats that you give there are American, the North American.
Yeah.
Do we know anything about whether there's anything similar that happens in Britain? I don't know much about staff.
I couldn't find any, and part of that is because I get most of my news online, so most people who write in English on the internet are Americans. But one of the interesting things about that 2012 survey, it was one of the best done. It had large sample sizes. It had really crudely worded questions. It was like, how many times has a fellow prisoner forced you to give them a blowjob, which sort of really pitching for a very low educational level and high levels of privacy. I don't think the same kind of systematic research has been done in prisons and in juvenile detention centres in the UK. I think partly because Chris Grayling kept stamping on the research, but I mean, so else is new. But I think it really does open up the need for this kind of systematic, gender-neutral research to be done basically everywhere in the world. And there's a woman, I think it's Sheffield University, called Elizabeth Bates, who's I think one of the leaders of not just sexual violence but domestic violence against men and by women in the UK. So if you just look up her Twitter. She's usually great.
Thank you, Sam. Other questions from the floor, or just observations or comments, and please do be kind of imaginative in those sort of wider thinking about what Sam said and your response to it. I do invite that.
Father David's asking a question in the chat where he says, Sam, what would your answer be to your second question? Other biblical examples? Well, I think the first one I think of is Lot and his daughters. After they run away from Sodom, they very deliberately get him drunk to the point where he doesn't know what is happening and then have sex with him. And that is not consent. If they'd had access to Hypnol, they would have used it. And I think we would very rightly recognize that as rape if it had happened the other way around, or if it happened to boys doing it towards their, two men doing it towards their mother. But I've seen it referred to as incest or as seduction. And it's like, well, no, it's rape. And I've even seen some feminist responses pushing back against that and saying, well, no, he must have raped them. Well, you don't know that. And again, I think this is the gender partisan goggles coming down and not really just taking the story at face value. Other examples, this might be pushing it slightly, but I'm not sure Jacob gives informed consent to Leah when they switch him out. Who's guilty there, whether it's Leah or Laban, or Leah and Laban, and possibly Rachel as well.
This is the one where he's worked for 7 years and he's and they basically do a bed trick where they swap it out, where he goes in presumably under cover of darkness to have sex with whom he thinks is Rachel, and actually turns out to be Leah. And under the Sexual Offences Act in the UK today, that if you deceive somebody as the nature of your identity and they give consent to Steve but you're actually Harry, that's not consent. I think that's absolutely fair enough. And who's guilty in that situation is a difficult question. Is Leah also being coerced into something? And perhaps immediately before the Mrs. Potiphar story, there's the story of Reuben and Tamar. And Reuben's one of Joseph's brothers. He marries his son, Judah and Tamar. He marries his son to a woman called Tamar. That son dies. And then there's a thing called levirate marriage, which is where you basically have to marry your brother's widow to have children in his line and provide for her. One son does that, and then he also dies. At this point, he's figured out this woman is trouble, and he doesn't allow his third son to do it because he's not of age yet. And so her solution is to trick her father-in-law into having sex with her so that she can get pregnant and have kids.
And it's slightly frustrating because whereas, you know, nobody comes off well in this story, it's clearly a story that vindicates Tamar. But this almost feels like reproductive coercion. And that law I mentioned, I've seen it referred to as an example of women being forced into sex. Well, no, it actually says that if your dead husband's brother won't marry you, you get to spit in his face in public and steal his sandal, which is a very big, like, shaming ritual. And, you know, if someone had spat in my face after I refused to sleep with them, I'd call the police. And it's just like, oh, there are bad things happening related to marriage in the ancient world. Women must be the victims. Well, no, that's not quite what's happening either. You know, I'm not a sperm bank. I'm not farming equipment. I don't just exist to be handed around between whatever female relative my society can't be bothered to give the resources to provide for herself. And it's that, you know, the male gender role is not just power and privilege. It's also this degree of being treated like a success object. And that also helps, and being given this kind of hyper agency and this kind of utilitarian sexism, this kind of flattery to get you to become this protector, this provider. And that can also obscure victimhood just as much as, you know, the domestic anonymity women have been restricted to at times. And sorry, yeah. Sorry, if we're going to address sexual violence, basically, I think we need to get a hold of all of this and bring it all into dialogue with each other. And we have not even begun, really. Sorry, Susie, go on.
All right. My personal comment would just be about how I feel like the question of power dynamics is always pertinent to this, and I hear a lot. I hear a lot of. I need to think a lot about what you're saying, but so I might have got the wrong end of the stick. But for instance, in the example you just gave, which was about a woman who would have absolutely no other recourse if she couldn't have children, like that, those kind of the systematic power imbalances that are inherent with that way of the gender. Like I don't think a lot of this violence is really about sexual attraction as much as it is about power and people being in power. But I don't know if that's really a question or a comment or whatever, but I'll just throw it out there. And then I've got one other thing in the chat as well from someone.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, there are some suggestions that when Potiphar was referred to as an officer of Pharaoh, he might be a eunuch, and married eunuchs were unusual. And again, as much as we can, we have to know the difference between an explanation as to why somebody is a toxic person or an abuser or an assaulter and an excuse. It does say that it's because he looked handsome. It doesn't ever specify, but there's, you know, bored rich women are a universal cultural phenomena, and it is not a legitimate response to being bored, but if you're going to deal with that person, a bit of sympathy for their situation isn't inappropriate. I think that's certainly fair. And yeah, so what was the comment from the chat?
Yeah, from Jan. Thank you, Jan. She asks a question. Do you know what psychological damage is caused to young male teenagers who have had sex with older, experienced women?
By all accounts, it's basically the same as to male teenagers, to female teenagers who have had sex with older men or any other gender. Sometimes they report less, but often studies about their sleep patterns, their self-esteem show it's just as bad. And I remember coming across a very good article about the fact that more than half of male sexual offenders in prisons in the UK had experienced had been victimized by women when they were teenagers. And I think this is one of the important things to do, is to take this entire conversation out of the gender war, because there is no way in which sexual violence against women and against men and by women and by men can be separated. They are part of one just horrendous inheritance and one awful system of sin that needs to be well, needs to be loved out of existence, quite frankly.
We're coming back to the question of using people and how that's inappropriate wherever it's found. April, I saw you switch on your screen. Did you want to make a comment or a question?
Yes, I'm very aware that we're close to time.
We are. Yours will be the last. Yep.
Yeah, trying to formulate a question. It probably goes back to what Susie was saying, and you know, nothing. I think, you know, Mark's just said using people is something that we should note wherever it comes in the Bible. I would be a tiny bit hesitant at using our current understandings of relationships back into the intention of the biblical writers, especially when you come to the stories like Tamar and like Leah. I think the Potiphar story is interesting. I think it's really interesting to sort of look at that as where, you know, the intention of Joseph as a Hebrew slave who is a victim, etc., and what that is helpful. But I just think I wouldn't want to attach the biblical weight into the modern or the contemporary statistics that you're saying about male and female perpetrators and the influence of that on current crime. I suppose that I just have a slight discomfort about that, but I think it's an interesting conversation.
Yeah, I definitely know what you mean. I mean, one of the examples is we think of consent in a very individual sense. So, for example, when Dinah, one of Joseph's sisters, is raped, it might not be that she doesn't give consent. It might be that the parental figures haven't given consent. This is, you know, consensual between the individuals involved, but not like the wider social structure hasn't given their blessing to it, so it's not consensual. So I do think we need to do a lot of careful thinking about how we relate modern categories to ancient categories, and you know, the fact that they're subsistence farming peasants under a constant threat of famine and invasion and all the rest of it. That produces a different set of demands, and it's not fair to translate simply. But I also think the response history, the reception history of these texts can also be helpful for illuminating our myopia around issues of sex and consent and violence and that type of thing.
I mean, David and Bathsheba is another example where the Bible apparently gives, you know, I mean, this is a conversation that could continue, but yeah, the power, looking at who has power, I think is where I would start with those stories.
Yeah, yes. Saying no to a king or to your slave mistress is a very difficult thing to do.
Sam, thank you so much. Can I invite people to put their screens on if you'd like, and we'll just give Sam a round of applause for doing that. So thank you very much.